Good morning and welcome to our 2023 budget seminar, broadcast to you live from the Crowe Canal Cafe on the 5th floor of our new offices on Mespil Road. My name is Brian Geraghty and I'm delighted to welcome you along to our annual budget seminar. A total of 11 billion of cost of living and budgetary spending measures is sure to make a sizable impact on the economy in the short term, but has it been targeted in the right direction? And what are the proposals most likely to affect business and employment? We are delighted to welcome back as our guest speaker this morning the renowned economist Jim Power, who is a prolific commentator on national finances and economic affairs. The running order this morning, which will be no more than an hour, will start with a panel discussion with our own partners in Crowe on the implications of the Budget 2023 announcements and specific details of some of the measures announced. I will then introduce our guest speaker, Jim Power, and we will finish off by answering some questions that have been submitted. Firstly, I'd like to get some housekeeping out of the way. Attendees' mics are muted. This is to ensure audio quality. We have over 300 attendees signed up for the event this morning, and we're delighted to welcome them. We will have two short polls, which we hope you will participate in. One I'll set up before our panel discussion, and the second one before we pass over to hear from Jim Power. We are recording the session and we will make it available to all participants afterwards. Thank you all for joining this morning, and so now let's begin. Our first poll, which should be popping up on your screen now, is to ask your opinion in the face of unprecedented developments in the global economy, with the energy crisis, a marked political shift to the right in many countries in Europe, and the cost of living increases. The budget included 11 billion of cost of living measures. Do you believe this is an appropriate response to the global challenges facing Ireland? While waiting for the results of the poll, I might introduce you to the members of our discussion panel, many of whom you will know, I expect. Lisa Kinsella is a partner in our tax department, dealing with a variety of domestic, international, corporate, and high net worth clients. She advises on employment taxes, intellectual property taxation, and company restructuring. Aidan Murphy, a partner with our corporate finance department. He also heads up our hospitality sector and is responsible for publishing the annual hotel industry survey, which serves as a benchmark for the sector. And Aidan will give us the business perspective on the budget implications. Cormac Doyle, one of our taxation partners, provides practical, strategic, and commercial advice across a range of taxation areas. He has extensive experience working with private clients and clients in the financial services, technology, and life sciences sectors. Jim Power is an independent economic and financial consultant and owner of Jim Power Economics, which he set up in 2009. He is a graduate of UCD and holds a BA and a Master's in Economic Science. He lectures on full-time MBA at Smurfit Business School and was previously Treasury Economist at AIB. He then jumped ship to the opposition, where he served as Chief Economist at Bank of Ireland and subsequently was Chief Economist at Friends First Group up to 2018. He's a board member of Love Irish Food. In February 2021, Jim and Chris Johns launched their podcast, The Other Hand, which is available on Apple and Spotify. Jim is a native of Waterford and is beaming into us from what is hopefully the sunny southeast this morning. So we have the results of the poll now, I think. So a broadly positive response, 61% yes, showing it is an appropriate response to the global challenges. 14% no, 25% unsure. It's a sizable proportion that are unsure, and no doubt Jim will be in a position to tell us whether we're correct to be positive about it broadly. So let's start our panel discussion. Lisa, can I start with you? There is a substantial amount of family and employee-based measures in the budget, between childcare, school books, widened tax bands, the electricity and rent credits, and third-level college fees. Can you give us a bit more detail about these?
Absolutely. Good morning, Brian, and good morning, everybody. I think the intention of yesterday's budget was to put money back in people's pockets, and I think that has been achieved to some extent. The increase in the tax bands means that a single person now can earn up to €40,000 at 20%, and a married couple with two incomes can earn up to €80,000 at 20%. We also see an increase in a number of the key tax credits. And I think overall between those two measures, it's expected that you would put about €800 back into people's pockets. We also saw the welcomed reintroduction of a rent tax credit, which is effectively a €500 credit. And this is going to apply for 2022. My understanding is it'll become available in early 23. So individuals who are renting will be able to apply for effectively a tax refund of €500 in the new year. On the employer's benefit side, we see the small benefits exemption being increased from €500 to €1,000. So this actually allows employers to reward their staff by way of tax-free, non-cash based bonuses. So they could be vouchers. So that's also applicable for 2022, which means if it's already been utilised, the €500 this year, there is further scope to give an additional benefit before the end of the year. And the plus side of that is that there's no employer's PRSI on that. We also saw the extension of the Help to Buy scheme to the end of 2024. Again, that's obviously very favourable. On, I suppose, the family side of things, and I do think that the Minister's intention was to assist that squeezed middle. I know not everybody was maybe pleased with what was introduced, that they felt there wasn't something there for them. But overall, I think that families with children should be relatively happy. We see a reduction in college registration fees, the introduction of free school books for primary school students, which will come into effect next autumn. And something that I had recent discussions with the Minister on when he was here at our office opening in July was around the cost of childcare and the barrier that that has with keeping safe predominantly women in the workforce full time. So we see an increase there in the subsidy from 50 cents per hour to 140 cents per hour. And I think overall that's intended to be €170 of a saving per month per child. So I think overall, yes, they have achieved getting some money back to the ordinary employee.
Very good. So, I mean, these measures will hopefully deal with the cost of living crisis that people are facing today. But Aidan, given the current labour shortage, we're told we have full employment at the moment and there is a shortage of workers in the workplace. Do you think these measures, coupled with the increase in the minimum wage, will have an impact on encouraging people back to the workforce, either on a full-time or a part-time basis, or even part-time workers taking more hours? Is that possible?
When I speak to businesses, so the number one challenge they have at the moment is recruitment of staff. It's putting pressure on their existing staff and on their operations. So I think this budget is very much, I suppose, pro-growth. We're coming out of COVID, and therefore there's a return to work. There's tourists coming back into the country. So I think the labour market is going to remain very tight for the next 12, 24 months. Therefore, I think any incentive that encourages people to work longer hours or to go back into the workplace is helpful. And therefore, I suppose if the starting point at which the higher rate of tax kicks in is €40,000, that will be very, very helpful. Aligned to that, what we often see is the issue of accommodation for staff and the cost of accommodation being very, very high. So I think in terms of encouraging, I suppose, more people back into the workplace and encouraging maybe more people into the country to help with the labour crisis, I think we need to address the accommodation crisis as well.
Very much so. I mean, it is apparent that you know, the accommodation crisis is probably at the root of every difficulty the country is facing, given that even importing workers will bring more competition into that sector. Cormac, the budget introduced a much needed business energy support scheme, which is announced to run till next February. We'd all like it to run a lot longer than that, or at least as long as the energy crisis is here. Can you tell us how this will work, and do you think it's enough to support SMEs with the crisis they're facing at the moment?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I suppose at the moment, really, the only details we have to go off of are what was in the actual budget speech itself. There wasn't much more, if any more detail in the documents that followed the speech. Because that said, the positive thing I think for the government and revenue commissioners who will be administering the scheme is that they have most of the infrastructure probably in place already to administer it, because it sounds like it will operate in a similar way to the EWSS, the COVID support scheme for employers. So hopefully the administrative pains that I'm sure both revenue and businesses and us all experienced with the EWSS and its predecessor, the TWSS, hopefully won't be as prevalent. I suppose for anyone who experienced the TWSS back at the beginning of 2020, there were 18 versions of the guidance produced on that between March and August 2020. So you'd like to think that it'll be rolled out in a much more efficient manner. So in terms of the details of it and how it will work, what we do know is it'll be a self-assessed scheme. The speech mentioned that it will apply to businesses carrying on a case one trade. Now, perhaps that was used in a non-specific way, but to us, what a case one trade implies is that a property rental company, for example, wouldn't be within the scope of this. It also implies that certain professions like solicitors, accountants, wouldn't be within the scheme either. Now, this legislation will have to go through many different stages of Finance Bill and Finance Act. So you'd like to think that that will be clarified and potentially expanded to the more intended businesses. Another condition is that the business has to be tax compliant. And in particular, coming out of COVID and a lot of the warehousing schemes, for example, that were in place, I think it's going to be very important for businesses that they check their current status in the context of any debts that may have been warehoused, what agreements have they got in place with revenue so that they can maintain that tax compliant status. At that point, the way the scheme will work is you'll compare the unit price for your energy for the period in 2022 versus the period in 2021. And again, there's detail around that. So unit price is not your total bill. There'll be things like standing charges that won't be included. And if there's a 50% increase on your unit price from the period in 21 to 22, then you're in. So you're into the scheme. And what you'll get then as a benefit is 40% of the increase in your unit price, capped at €10,000 per month. They also mentioned an annualized cap, which we don't have the details for yet or what that'll be. And obviously the whole scheme is subject to EU approval. So I'm sure we're going to get further detail over the coming weeks and months on it. But maybe just to address your final point, or the second part of the question, Brian, around is it enough? I suppose it's a difficult one to say, but I suppose if you look at it like this, if a business was to cap out at the €10,000 per month, that's obviously a positive. I mean, there's €10,000 being put back into the business. But if you're capping at that, that means that you've incurred a 25,000 per month increase. So you're actually still suffering a €15,000 per month increase in your costs, which is obviously significant. So I think it's certainly going to help businesses, but is it enough? Might be one that we bat over to Jim. He might have a few more thoughts on that later on.
Very good. I mean, there's a lot in that, in fairness. Businesses that are facing into, or small and medium-sized enterprises who have debt warehousing will find it particularly difficult, I would expect, if they're facing into trying to deal with the repayment of that from the 1st of January 2023, as well as facing increases in the minimum wage and energy costs. It's likely to have a significant impact and may need a further examination by the government, I would expect. Lisa, another measure, somewhat obscure measure, was announced in relation to the KEEP scheme.
Mm-hmm.
This is underused and a somewhat cumbersome scheme. But will the changes make it worth looking at again, do you think?
Yeah, and I suppose just to give context, the Keep scheme was introduced a couple of years ago to reward key employees within SMEs by granting them share options whereby when they cashed them in or they were redeemed or sold, they could get capital gains tax treatment. Up to now, it's been really underutilized because there was a lot of very restrictive conditions. In Finance Act 2019, the minister actually announced a number of changes, but those were subject to EU approval. So fortunately, yesterday, he was able to communicate that the EU approval had been granted, and in addition to the other measures that he introduced. So it's great to see that EU approval coming through, because that actually has widened the scheme to, say, more group type structures. So we now see that a holding company that has a number of subsidiaries could potentially avail of the scheme. It also allows for, say, a property rental company to be within that structure without excluding that holding company. A specific amendment that was introduced yesterday was around buybacks, which I think is a great idea, because very often there isn't a third-party sale on the horizon. So permitting a buyback allows the company to get the money over to the employee without there being a market for selling the shares. Again, like all these things, the devil.
Yeah, capital gains tax rate.
Yes, exactly. But all these things, obviously, the devil will be in the details. So I don't want to get overly excited about it, but I think, yes, it is quite positive. There are a couple of things I think I would have liked to have seen, but because the scheme has been extended to 2025, maybe there's still time for the minister to look at that. And I think one of those things, which I definitely think would benefit our clients, is situations where we have a holding company structure with a number of very different subsidiaries, and you might hire, say, a CEO or a CFO to work in a specific subsidiary. Currently, the shares have to be granted in the holding company. I would have liked to have seen maybe an amendment where the shares could be granted at subsidiary levels, so the individual is being rewarded for their direct contribution
with that company.
To that company. Yeah, absolutely. But I think, hopefully there's still time for that to be introduced.
Very good. Cormac, there was also some changes to the R&D tax credit scheme, which may help smaller businesses reconsider claiming this credit. This was also a credit that was, to a certain extent, always subject to examination by the revenue, and you'd be loath to invite them to review your records if you have the choice. Do these changes help the smaller enterprises apply for this?
Yeah, I think so, Brian. There was, I suppose, a number of changes announced yesterday, and again, the mechanism and the detail around how they'll be administered is hopefully going to follow, certainly by the finance bill. But in terms of incentivizing uptake of the credit, in particular on SMEs, we think there's enough there to probably to achieve that for the government. I suppose from a summary point of view, what did it do? Well, at the moment, there's a cap on the amount of refundable credit that can be paid to a company. So when a company claims the tax credit, that credit is potentially refundable over a 3-year period. But the amount that can be refunded in any 1 year is capped, and that cap is linked to the amount of employment taxes that the business has paid. So they're removing that cap in terms of the amount that can be refunded in 1 year. So that's a positive. Also, the repayment of the credit is now going to be on a fixed 3-year period. So again, at the moment, your credit is first offset against corporation tax payable, and then the balance is refundable over 3 years, subject to certain conditions. So now your total credit will just be refundable or repayable over a fixed 3-year period. The third key element of the change is that now, instead of having to offset against corporation tax first, the business will essentially have a choice to either take a repayment of the credit or can request it to be offset against other taxes, so potentially other tax liabilities that the company has. And then I think one of the key changes for SMEs in particular is that up to €25,000 of the credit can be repaid now in year 1 rather than spread over 3 years. So I suppose for an SME, for example, you know, if you have a company that potentially had a €100,000 spend on R&D activities, that gives them a credit in simplistic terms of 25,000. Now, under the current scheme, it could take you 3 years or potentially more by the time you file your corporation tax returns to actually get the repayment of that credit.
Okay.
Now, what the tax authorities are saying is, or what the government is saying is, we'll potentially refund that full €25,000 in year one. So it really accelerates the cash flow benefit for potentially an SME or a startup company, where obviously cash is so important in the first number of years. So we think in particularly for an SME, that will be a benefit. For maybe the larger businesses, or even if you look at some of the international companies and the FDI type companies, if the credit that you're claiming in a year is significant, so if it's already over potentially €75,000, that change doesn't really have an impact. But there were some, I suppose, technical changes that will benefit those international companies. The way the credit is repaid, one of the reasons for changing that is to bring it in line with some of the recommendations from the OECD on some of the international tax projects that are ongoing. So I think the changes to it are positive for both SMEs and SMEs in particular, but also for it's going to be a benefit to some of the international companies, the FDI type companies, in terms of keeping them compliant and keeping Ireland compliant with the OECD changes.
Very good, very good. Aidan, for the hospitality sector, a positive is obviously the energy support scheme, which I understand is due to run until next February. Next March 1st seems to be a difficult day for the hospitality sector. We have the VAT rate increases from that day as well. So we've been through this before with rates going up and down for the hospitality sector. Can you tell us what the impact will likely to be on the sector?
I think we're going through unusual times for most businesses, where all input costs and payroll costs are seeing, as with the effect of inflation. So far for hotels, they've managed to be able to pass on those higher costs through higher prices. And I suppose the concern is that as we go forward, the customer will only tolerate so many price increases. So the last time VAT changed from 9 to 13.5%, in our 2019 survey, we were able to see that 50% of the VAT increase had to be absorbed by hoteliers. So in essence, the cost to hoteliers was €120,000, and it's kind of ironic that the max benefit under the energy support scheme is €120,000. So while they're getting a support on one hand, it's been taken away on the other. My own view is that it's happening probably too soon, that the hotels haven't been allowed to recover their balance sheets coming out of COVID, and that it should have been delayed. And I think it'll cause a lot of pain for entities that have very high levels of food sales, where the margin on them is much, much lower, and therefore they can't really absorb that VAT cost.
I see. Yeah, it's going to be a difficult period for them, and you know, facing into the winter, it's not exactly the height of the season for them. But we'll now have our second poll, and having this poll should appear on your screen shortly now. Having heard what the panel have to say, do you believe this budget will be beneficial to your business? So we'll leave you 30 seconds or so to deal with that. But I just would say that I think on the energy support scheme, particularly what you said, Cormac, I think a lot more clarity on it will be needed for businesses in the short term. You know, will businesses who have a number of different outlets in the same ownership or same group or even the same company, will the 10K limit apply to each unit, or will it apply to overall? I mean, that will have a significant impact on it. And then separately, you know, as you say, even though the 10,000 might be a helpful support, you're still dealing with 60% of the cost increase, and with the minimum wage increase of what is it, 80 cents, 7.6% of an increase, it'll make it very difficult for many businesses in the service and hospitality sectors to bear. There's no doubt about it. I hope that didn't unduly influence your response to our poll, but we might have the results of that now at this stage. So yes, broadly positive, 46% in favour, 23% no, and a sizable cohort still unsure as to whether this budget is going to work for us. So maybe we could now turn to Jim and ask him for his commentary in relation to the budget 2023, and perhaps you can answer the question in our first poll, which was, is this an appropriate response to the current fiscal environment?
Good morning, everybody. I guess that my perspective would be that the high level of uncertainty that came across in the answers is justified, because we are in pretty unprecedented times. And, you know, yesterday we saw the largest budget package in absolute terms we've ever seen in this country. And nobody knows at this stage how it's going to work, because I guess my concluding comment today will be that uncertainty is the byword out there at the moment. We live in incredibly uncertain times. So that level of uncertainty doesn't surprise me in the least. What I want to do, first of all, is to sort of set the international background for what was delivered by the two ministers yesterday. You know, since March 2020, the global economy has come through an incredibly challenging, volatile period with COVID-19. We saw at the end of last year, inflationary pressure starting to pick up as economies reopened, as we saw repressed demand coming back into the system. And that repressed demand came up against supply side difficulties, and inflation took off towards the end of last year. But the view that was shared by most, including central bankers over the last, at the beginning of this year, was that the inflation would prove temporary, and that as we progress through 2022, inflationary pressures would start to ease again. And then, of course, we were hit with the Ukraine crisis on February 24th. We've seen huge supply side difficulties. We've seen inflation start to take off again. And the net result is that central bankers have started to increase interest rates very aggressively. The global economic outlook is now looking incredibly uncertain. And nobody is quite sure as to how the next 12 months will progress in terms of global economy. I think it is safe to say that recessionary conditions are likely in some of the major economic jurisdictions, such as the United Kingdom, such as the Euro area, and also the United States. And I think for over the next 6 months, you know, economic challenges in those jurisdictions will become more intense. It is clear to me that central bankers have now taken the view that they will have to do whatever it takes to make sure that inflation is brought back under control, that it does not become entrenched in the system. And in that regard, it's clear that the Federal Reserve is going to increase interest rates by at least another 2% over the coming months. I think following the debacle that was the UK mini budget last week, the Bank of England is likely to increase interest rates much more aggressively over the next few months. And of course, both of those central banks, by taking those interest rate actions, will actually push their economies, if not into recession, certainly very close to recession. And then we have the situation in the United Kingdom, or in the Euro area, where I never believed that Europe needed the same level of interest rate tightening as other jurisdictions like the United States, because Europe is not characterized by excessive demand. The inflation is really a supply side problem, and interest rates are not that effective in terms of addressing a supply side problem. But however, you know, the European Central Bank has increased interest rates by 75 basis points over the last, since July. And 1.25%. We got 0.5% in July. We got 75 basis points, 0.75% at the September meeting. And it's clear that this ECB rate of 1.25% at the moment is at least likely to double over the next 3 or 4 months. So in a nutshell, the global economic backdrop against which the budget yesterday was prepared and presented is incredibly challenging and uncertain. And for a small open economy like Ireland, you know, inevitably those sorts of pressures will start to impact. It is interesting, I guess, in terms of most economic metrics that we look at, the impact of these very uncertain global developments have been pretty minimal. I mean, the Irish economy is still growing strongly. If you look at some of the key indicators like tax revenue buoyancy is still incredibly strong. And of course, that is what facilitated the generous nature of the budgetary package yesterday. That continues. Income tax, VAT, and corporation tax, which account for around 84% of total tax revenues. All three are growing very, very strongly. And I guess the piece in there that is of most interest is what's happening on the corporation tax side. Last year, we collected over 15 billion, which was the highest level of corporation tax we've ever collected. And if you think back sort of 7 or 8 years ago, we'd be lucky to get 4 billion in corporation tax. So we got over 15 last year. And the budgetary, the background stuff yesterday showed that corporation taxes are expected to hit around 21 billion this year. And of course, the question then is how much of that tax take is actually sustainable? And the Department of Finance is worried that in the event of negative external developments, particularly for those multinational companies, that you could see at least 6 billion of those tax revenues disappearing. And a concentration risk issue for Ireland is that 10 large multinationals account for about 53% of the total corporation tax take. So we have this concentration risk, but nevertheless, tax revenues are very strong, and that's indicative of an economy that is still growing. On the trade side, the export performance driven heavily by the chemical and pharmaceutical sector, which accounts for 65% of our total merchandise exports, is growing very strongly. But even the agri-food side is also growing strongly, which is good news. You know, when you think about the Brexit scenario that has unfolded over the last couple of years. But the Irish export side doing very well in the first 7 months of the year, up by 27%. The housing market, the labour market, of course, before I talk about housing, is still incredibly strong. You know, at the end of June, we had 2.55 million people in employment, a record level. The unemployment rate in August was down at 4.3%, which is effectively full employment. And that resonates with, you know, some of the comments from the panelists about the recruitment and retention of workers being a serious business challenge at the moment. And Ireland is not unique. Many other countries, particularly the United States, facing the same sorts of labour market shortages. The housing market, unfortunately, in my view, is still growing strongly in the sense that demand is still outpacing supply, and house price inflation and rising rents are still a massive issue. So all of those indicators are indicative of an economy that's doing well. There are, however, emerging signs that the international stresses and rising interest rates are starting to impact. The construction sector is definitely, in my view, slowing down. Business investment sentiment is slowing down, and many investment projects, I gather, are now being reconsidered or are being put on hold for the moment. Consumer confidence has fallen sharply over the last 8 months. No surprises whatsoever about that, because the Irish consumer is facing into a whirlwind of rising interest rates, all of this international economic uncertainty and so on. So people, and the cost of living, of course. So people are justifiably concerned, and consumer confidence has fallen sharply. and it's not yet back at the lows seen at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, but it is moving steadily in that direction. And this is now starting to be reflected in a slowdown in consumer spending. I think if there was one positive indicator about the future for the Irish consumer side of the economy, it's the fact that we're still sitting on a record level of personal savings, 144 billion at the end of May. During the pandemic, there was involuntary saving because people were still earning, but they couldn't spend. Whereas over the last 6 months, despite the opening up of the economy post-COVID, we are still seeing savings growing, and that's indicative of precautionary saving. In other words, people are more worried about the future and are saving more as a consequence. Before I talk specifically about the budget, the one thing that Pascal Donoghue made very clear yesterday, and the Department of Finance forecast backed this up. If you look at modified domestic demand in the Irish economy, this year it's likely to grow by over 7%. It is forecast to slow down to 1.2% next year. Okay, modified domestic demand is the real economic activity occurring on the ground when you strip out the distortions created by some multinational activities such as intellectual property asset transfers and also the aircraft leasing side. But if you strip that out, modified domestic demand is regarded as a realistic measure of what's happening on the ground. As I say, that is forecast to slow from over 7% this year to 1.2% next year. That represents a significant deceleration in growth. And indeed, that sort of growth scenario could easily see at least 1 quarter of negative economic activity. When I look at the Irish economic balance sheet at the moment in terms of what the risks are, the foreign direct investment anchor is still very strong. The IDA is still doing an excellent job in terms of bringing new investment into the country. The banking system is solid in the sense that it has not built up the sort of exposure that it did in the run-up to 2008-9. And of course, the central bank's prudential mortgage lending rules have had a key role to play in that regard. Personal balance sheets are healthy. We've seen personal debt fall significantly in the last decade. And at the same time, as I've just said, we've seen personal savings growing. So the personal sector isn't that exposed at the moment. The labour market is still very tight. And as I say, recruitment and retention is the biggest challenge. But then, what are the risk factors? Obviously, that external economic background is very, very threatening. And what would be particularly threatening for Ireland would be if you started to see a significant slowdown in the global technology market. And given the concentration risk I alluded to earlier, with 10 major multinationals, not all in the IT area, but some are, if they were badly affected by some sort of global tech slowdown, and we'll see that first coming out of San Francisco or Silicon Valley precisely, that's one to watch. So, I would say that for the foreseeable future, a greater level of business caution is required. It's a very uncertain environment. Interest rates are rising. So I think caution on the part of business would be an appropriate response in such an uncertain environment. I would also feel that, if we do get a correction in the Irish economy, you'd hope, and the logic would suggest it won't be that significant, but some sort of healthy correction actually would not be a bad thing, in the sense that it could take some of the froth out of the economy, particularly on the cost side that we're seeing at the moment. I also think, it is important that we do not try and totally spend our way out of these difficulties as we did in the 1980s, when we created a serious problem with our public finances. The good thing about the package of budget measures introduced yesterday was that it is being financed by tax revenues rather than borrowing. And that's indicative of a strong economy, delivering strong tax revenue buoyancy. And indeed, following the measures introduced in the budget yesterday, the general government balance, that is the budget deficit effectively, is expected to be in surplus of 1 billion this year, and a surplus of 6.2 billion is penciled in for next year. It is also the case, and Pascal Donoghue alluded to this yesterday, Ireland still has a high level of debt, 225 billion this year, and that is expected to be the peak, and it's expected to start to stabilize and come down over the next couple of years. But that translates into average debt per head of population of 44,000, which is one of the highest in the world. So there is a debt vulnerability that we need to be careful about. The objectives of the budget gesture are quite clear. It was addressing the cost of living crisis, the escalation in the cost of doing business, the very uncertain global economic backdrop, rising interest rates, the tight labour market, serious problems in the supply of childcare and the cost of childcare, the ongoing escalation in the cost of housing for both renters and owner-occupiers, and of course, the whole climate change agenda. You know, any budget in the current environment should be addressing those sorts of issues to a certain degree. You know, the package yesterday of 11.3 billion, and I say 11.3 billion because the narrative out there is that this was a package of 11 billion. Actually, they also put aside 300 million from the contingency reserve fund that was set up to deal with Brexit and COVID. There's funding in that fund, and 300 million of that is being allocated to the budgetary package that was announced yesterday. So we're looking at 11.3 billion. The core budget package is 6.9 billion, and then we saw the sort of once-off package of just over 4 billion. So it's a significant 4.4 billion. It's a significant fiscal injection into the economy. 11.3 billion. You know, as I say, it is the biggest fiscal package that we've ever seen in this country. So, you know, to summarize, it's an incredibly large fiscal package, 11.4 billion. It is designed to address the cost of living crisis, the external uncertainties, rising interest rates, and of course, the political reality that exists out there at the moment, you know, with the main opposition party pushing for very significant levels of spending. So obviously, the government parties were going to have to respond to that. As I say, Ireland still has a dangerously high level of debt we need to be mindful of. Thankfully, tax revenue buoyancy is facilitating the budget largesse we're seeing at the moment without the need to borrow. The note of caution here would be in the event of a significant deterioration on the corporate tax side, you know, Ireland could be left significantly exposed. But I also think from a prudential point of view, you know, the minister is putting 2 billion into the National Reserve Fund this year and 4 billion in 2023. That is sensible, that is prudent. A rainy day fund is appropriate in the current environment. But at the end of the day, you know, the reality is that the budget we saw yesterday, as much as it was trying to address economic problems, it should also be seen heavily through the political prism. You know, it's being driven by the sort of populist politics that is taking hold in many countries at the moment. And we saw it writ large in the United Kingdom last week, for example, with the mini budget that was introduced. So, you know, in overall terms, I would be a fiscal conservative. I would be concerned about the manner in which government spending is expanding. But I also recognize the pragmatic economic and political reality that exists at the moment. It was never going to be any other way. This was always going to be a budget that was going to throw a lot of money into the economy. But, and I think this is important, that budgetary package and its effectiveness is predicated on the current global shock being short-lived. And unfortunately, we don't know what the definition of short-lived is. And if the current global difficulties were to continue into 2023, it is certainly possible that the government will have to come back to the drawing board again with a similar package of measures for households and small businesses particularly. So I guess politically and economically, it is probably an appropriate response in the current environment. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Thanks, Jim. There's a lot to think about there, and indeed, I think you're right in that to a great extent the difference between the political parties is that the current incumbents have taken a kind of a suck it and see approach. I heard Micheál Martin last night say that, you know, they may have to re-examine the position in relation to the energy crisis in particular, in the face of the opposition's proposals to write a blank check in relation to covering the excess costs. So I think, you know, you're right in that it is a political response. It is very much in line with what Sinn Féin had proposed in terms of the amount of that was involved, but they've just targeted in different areas and probably taken a slower and moderate approach in terms of seeing how the energy crisis pans out. So we might now turn to some questions that have been submitted. One of them actually now is very relevant in terms of what you've told us, Jim, in relation to our concentration. This one says, does the budget maintain Ireland as an attractive location for foreign direct investment? Not sure whether that's a new foreign direct investment or existing foreign direct investment, but maybe, Crowe, you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, Brian, good question, you know, given that we've spoken a lot about the SME kind of sector in particular throughout this morning, but I think from the FDI or the multinational side, there was certainly some welcome elements, I think, in the budget that was announced. We've already talked about the R&D credit, which, as we said, is a bit of a crossover. There's benefits there for the, you know, domestic SME businesses as well as the multinationals. You know, in particular, you look at that concentration of 10 businesses that Jim mentioned, or those 10 companies. I would imagine that a lot of those are involved in R&D, you know, so keeping the Irish R&D scheme compliant with the OECD and the international rules was probably almost like an unseen benefit, you know, that because it's quite technical issue. I suppose as well as that, there was an extension of the knowledge development box regime, which I'd say probably a relatively speaking low uptake on that. But I think certainly perceptually, you know, in terms of how Ireland is viewed internationally as having a regime like that is very important. When it was brought in, one of the key points that the government had with that was that it was fully OECD compliant. So it was compliant with international standards, and the extension, but also a change to it, which was effectively going to increase the rate from 6.25 to 10%. Again, comes back to Ireland trying to stay in line and stay in step with the OECD and the international regime. And there was also an extension of the SARP regime. So again, I don't think there was a slight change in it, maybe, in terms of the level of income that you need to hit to qualify. But again, extending the SARP regime, which is around international assignees coming to Ireland, you know, extending the knowledge development box, you know, slightly improving the R&D. I think a lot of those are kind of messages or indicators to international businesses that, you know, that Ireland is still very much an attractive location for those activities. Yeah,
indeed. I read one of the commentators this morning saying that the budget was a missed opportunity to try and rebalance that concentration of dependency on foreign corporation tax. Could they have done more for the SME sector, Lisa, do you think?
I mean, I'd always like there to be more for the SME sector, but I think, you know, coming back to Jim's speech, that, you know, this was about putting money back into the economy, giving money to the individuals that are like struggling, and I suppose it's been funded by tax receipts, you know, and so in that case, it's quite difficult for the minister in this budget to potentially increase maybe reliefs that we would like to have seen really increased. In the recent Commission on Taxation and Welfare report, it was noted about potentially extending entrepreneur relief to angel investors. Now, that would be really, really helpful, but I just don't think the timing was right for that. To kind of flip it a little bit, there was things also in that report that we wouldn't have liked to have seen introduced. So I'm very happy that hasn't occurred, like maybe curtailing, business reliefs, reducing inheritance tax thresholds for children. And I think there was a little bit of fear that maybe the entrepreneur relief would be curtailed in a way. So, those things didn't happen. So I think like overall, I want to be positive and end on a positive note that yes, there are always things that could be done, but maybe not in this budget.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the particular way of stimulating the SME sector is more or less to allow investment into those businesses.
Absolutely.
That will make it attractive, and Ireland is one of the countries that taxes the returns from those investments quite highly.
Absolutely.
We have another question which I might pose to you, Jim, if you don't mind. There's a global corporation tax deal. What are its implications for Ireland?
Okay. Yeah, the first thing I would say, and I guess it's sort of answering the last question before I move on to this question, and that is in relation to what this means for the SME sector. I think it's important. Okay, the energy support scheme is important, but it's also important that we try and maintain demand in the economy, because consumer spending is really important to a lot of SMEs. So in that regard, the SME treatment should not just be seen as the energy package, it's also the more general stimulus to the economy. In relation to the whole corporation tax side, last October, the G20 and the OECD agreed a global tax deal due to be implemented early in 2023. That's now been pushed out. It had two pillars. The first pillar was the allocation of profits for tax purposes. Basically, they're trying to ensure that multinationals pay more tax in the jurisdictions where they sell their goods and services rather than in the jurisdiction where the balance sheet resides. And I'm delving into the expertise of the accountants on the panel at the moment, but that, as I understand it, is basically what Pillar 1 is. Pillar 2 then is about a global minimum corporation tax rate of 15%. There's a meeting of ECOFIN next week where the EU will be seeking a final decision. And one of the problems has been that the Hungarians have actually refused to sign up to this deal. So there's a lot of political bartering going on at a European level at the moment. But the Europeans made it clear recently, a number of European countries, and I think Ireland would join this, that they will go ahead with the 15%, regardless of whether they get unanimity at an EU level or not. So in other words, they will implement it through domestic legislation, and that is possible. So for Ireland's sake, I hope that 15% minimum tax rate is actually introduced as quickly as possible, because I think it's a good outturn for Ireland. And the danger would be that if a deal was failed to be agreed, that the uncertainty would go on, and you could end up with a much different outcome, less advantageous one from an Irish perspective. So let's try and kill this speculation, uncertainty, get the deal written. I think those global tax developments should not have significant implications for foreign direct investment in Ireland. But the proviso here is, and this is a significant proviso in my view, we need to ensure that we focus in on all of the non-tax elements of our FDI offering, because the tax advantage is going to become slightly less and there's more global tax competition. So we've got to focus on stuff like the quality of the labor force, being able to provide a young, well-educated, English-speaking labor force is incredibly important. And that's why investment in education is crucial. And that worries me about the change in the funding of third-level education that was announced in the budget yesterday. I sure hope the universities get the funding from government when these fees are being cut back for student contribution, because investment in education is crucial. We need to look at the IT infrastructure. That goes without saying. We need to look at the physical infrastructure. We need to look at the quality of public services, health, education. And I think housing is the big one. And that disappoints me somewhat in the budget yesterday. I don't believe enough attention was paid, particularly to the rental side of the housing market, because if housing is unavailable or too expensive to buy or to rent, that is a serious issue with our national competitiveness. So I think, and I hope, once this global corporation tax deal is eventually crossed the line, that we really as a country focus on those other non-tax elements of our competitiveness.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. That global tax deal is likely only to affect the very larger corporations, isn't that right? It's companies that are turning over more than 750 million. So I mean,
if I may say, it could be those 10 companies that are so important, you know.
Indeed. But like, I mean, ironically, if it does come in, you'd imagine that it would increase the take from those 10 companies even further, from 12.5 up to 15%. But on that positive note, we might wrap up. We're just approaching 11 o'clock, and I'd like to thank everybody for attending this morning. Thank our panel, Cormac, Lisa and Aidan, and in particular thank Jim Power for joining us this morning and giving us the benefit of his view in relation to Budget 2023. And we would look forward to talking to you all very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.